I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to our conversation with the Speaker Presumptive of the Texas House, Dade Phelan. This is the Tribune's first virtual event of 2021, and we have many more planned for the 5 months of the 87th legislature. For instance, be sure to tune in this Thursday at 8 a.m. when our executive editor, Ross Ramsey, interviews Controller Glenn Hager. We'll be talking today for about 30 minutes. I'll do my best to incorporate some of the questions you've submitted in advance. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors. Lone Star College, the presenting sponsor of all of our events during the 2021 session. DoorDash, the Texas Association of School Business Officials. Water Grows, the Texas Federation of Drugstores, the Beer Alliance of Texas, Texas 2036, Raise Your Hand Texas, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, CAMMACK and Strong PC, and NRG Energy. If you'd like to join the online conversation with us, tweet using the hashtag #TTEvents. It's now my pleasure to introduce Representative Dade Phelan, Republican of Beaumont, first elected to his District 21 seat in 2014. A Beaumont native and University of Texas at Austin grad, he's been a member of the House Calendars, Appropriations, and Elections Committees, has been vice chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, and most recently chaired the State Affairs Committee. In early November, he secured the votes of enough of his colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to lead them in the 87th legislature. Tomorrow, on the session's opening day, one of the first orders of business in the lower chamber will be to formally hand off the gavel. Then he will be Mr. Speaker. Today, for the last time, I'll say, Mr. Chairman, thank you for joining us.
I appreciate that. I enjoyed hearing that for the last time.
Okay, well, let's not jinx it. We'll see what happens.
Let's not jinx it either. You're right. We have 24 hours to go. Yes, sir.
24 hours to go. So I thought we'd start with the news of the day, Mr. Chairman. The revenue estimate. 2 hours ago, Controller Hager told us how much money would be available to spend in the next 2-year budget cycle. Less than was available in the last 2-year cycle, but more than we were expecting. The sky is not falling, apparently. What's your reaction to that, and what are the consequences of that?
I think it's about where we thought we would be over the last few months. We kind of landed where we thought the estimate may be for the current biennium, and then, of course, for 22-23. I will say that we have a challenge ahead of us. There's no doubt about it. We have a challenging budget cycle. We have 1,000 people moving to Texas every day. And I use this line all the time. People probably get sick of hearing it, but they're not bringing asphalt when they move here. And they're not bringing public school teachers when they come here. They're not bringing DPS officers and prison guards when they come here. So we have to provide that. That's the core essential services of the state of Texas, or of those items. And we have less to work with. That's unfortunate. Right. But the state of Texas is still the best place to do business. Sure. It's still to me, the strongest economy in the entire country. So we will emerge from this COVID-19 fog, if you want to call it that, better than any state, quicker than any state. So we're just going to have to get to work sooner rather than later. And my colleagues are ready to do that. I've had multiple conversations with them. They're ready to get to work. And the budget, as always, will rule the day.
Are there any areas of the budget, Chairman, that you consider to be off the table for cuts?
We have to look at everything. I mean, I've been on appropriations. I was on appropriations for 2 sessions, and there's no article that you don't go through with a fine tooth comb. That's your job, right? Same with Senate Finance. You always have to take a fresh look at each budget as you go through that process. You know, if you look at your budget back home, or your budget at the Tribune, or my budget back home, or my budget in my real estate business, the item you spend the most money on is what you kind of care about the most. Yep. And if you look in Texas, we've always spent our largest item in our budget each session is Article 3, which is public education and higher education. I don't see that changing. That is our priority coming through this pandemic. Children, we cannot abandon our children when they need us the most. But you're not saying, Mr. Chairman, that you're not going to cut public ed. You're not saying you're not going to cut higher ed. You said everything's on the table. I said that we've got to go through every article, every agency, and every receipt, and look at it holistically, obviously. And we have to balance our budget. And we can only spend as much money as the comptroller says we have to spend. If we can only spend as much money as the economy has grown. So we have to go through all those different types of restrictions, which are fine. And we've done it before and we'll do it again. But
Right.
I have full faith in the Appropriations Committee that they will do a fantastic job.
Are you willing to consider new revenue sources to add to the amount of money you have to spend, Chairman, or is this it?
Well, what new revenue sources are you speaking to?
Well, there are only a couple of new revenue sources that might be available. The three-letter word tax might be on the table, probably less popular than some others. But I mean, is there another way for you to find money to add to this group, or is this pretty much you're going to go to war with the army you've got?
I think we go to the war with the army we got. I thought you were going to suggest something else as far as new revenue, as others have over the last several weeks.
Are you referring to marijuana or gambling, Mr. Speaker?
I've heard those two brought up quite a bit. No, yeah. I don't see new taxes and new fees being acceptable to the legislature.
Right. So just since you brought it up, are you open to the idea of gambling and the effect that it might have on the economy or marijuana? Since again, you're alluding to the possibility of some other things that have been discussed.
Well, it gets brought up in every conversation, and if you want to discuss those two as revenue sources, do it through the prism of a long-term commitment, because it will not fix the current budget deficit or the 22-23 budget issues we have. It will take years before you see any revenue from either one of those options. So, to think you can plug and play on either one of those is not factual. It won't work in this current budget cycle.
So we're clear. This is then the amount of money we have to work with in your mind. This is the budget we're going to write.
Correct.
Okay. Even if the budget is not as bleak and painful as some people predicted, this is going to be a tough session, given everything going on in the world. One might reasonably ask, why would anybody want to be Speaker? So I'm going to ask you, why did you want to be Speaker? You know the kind of conditions you were going to get into. Why'd you want the job?
That's a great question. I ask myself that every morning since this occurred. Honestly, Evan, I didn't want to be Speaker. I did not want to do it. And throughout the COVID shutdown, so to speak, and I guess members had time on their hands. And throughout the summer, really beginning in May, I started getting phone calls from my colleagues asking me to consider it.
Right.
And, one phone call is one thing, but, after a few here and a few there, and it starts to really span the spectrum of the Republican caucus, I started thinking, well, maybe I should consider doing this. Maybe this is what's best for the Texas House. And as we got closer to the election, I felt very certain that the Republicans would keep the majority. I actually went on a Texas Trib Fest, a show with Celia Israel, and we discussed it. And I gave a pretty good argument why the Republicans would keep the Texas House. And if you go back and listen to it, it was pretty dead on. I was seeing different poll numbers, and I thought we would keep the Texas House. So I started taking it more serious as we got closer and closer in November. And come election night, we had a game plan, and we went out there and executed it. And I was able to, get commitments from colleagues across the spectrum, both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. I'm very proud of it. I think it will serve the House very well to have that diverse support.
But you're making it sound like you were drafted into service reluctantly. You could have said no, right?
It's hard to say no when enough of your colleagues think you're the right person for the job.
All right. We're less than 24 hours away from the start of the session, as you said. Given the events of the last week in Washington, D.C., Chairman, do you worry about the safety and security at our Capitol on opening day and going forward? Will there be any changes to the building's access because of what happened last week?
I will say that the Department of Public Safety and our National Guard are obviously on high alert, as they should be. Texas is, we're one of the most noticeable states in the country where this Capitol is just reopened. It just so happens that session starts tomorrow. Yep. After following what happened in D.C. last week, so I can see the concern, but I've also see the presence on the ground right now, and we're getting security briefings on a daily basis. I feel confident that we will not be caught off guard like what occurred in Washington D.C. I don't see that happening at the Texas Capitol.
I read your reaction to the insurrection. I think you gave an interview to the Beaumont Enterprise over the last couple of days. You said this was not the act of patriots, that the Bill of Rights doesn't condone violence or trespassing. Do you believe there was any justification for people to be upset? Do you share the belief of the rioters that the election was stolen, Mr. Chairman?
The public voted. The votes were tallied. The votes were verified. There were lawsuits in state court. There were lawsuits in federal court. And the process has worked its way through the system, and we are where we are. The president himself has said it's now time for a peaceful transfer of power. I understand if you don't know what's going. For instance, I don't know what happened in Georgia. I don't live in Georgia. I've been paying attention to Texas, right?
Yeah.
So, some folks from around the state may have, come together in D.C. without all the information that they should have had, and what happened was unconscionable and should never happen again. I worked in D.C. Briefly and never want to go back. But I have deep respect for the process they have up there, just like we have our process here. And what happened to the U.S. Capitol was just unimaginable. Should never happen again. And I look back and I feel for the staffers and the U.S. Capitol Police, because that was really, in all my lifetime, I never thought I'd see something like that occur.
Speaker, on the question, or Speaker Presumptive, on the question of Capitol access, a lot of talk about how the coronavirus will affect the plans and protocols in the building during the session. The pandemic is raging, caseloads and hospitalizations are spiking across the state. We now have the more contagious strain of the virus present in Texas. How do you strike the right balance between public access and public health during a session like this?
It's an enormous question. And I've entertained it a million times. And I can just say that Texas has always prided itself on how open it was to the public, and how often we allow the public to come in unfettered and testify for hours after hours after hours. As being chair of state affairs, I sat through some very long hearings last session. Yep. And I was proud to do so. I wanted to hear from the public. There's 150 of us in the Texas House, and none of us want to pass legislation that impacts 29 to 30 million Texans without hearing from those Texans. But we're also dealing with the first global pandemic in 102 years. And we have to, protect the public. We have to protect the staff, protect members, obviously, as we get through these 140 days. So it is a balancing act, and we're going to take it a day at a time, a week at a time, a month at a time. I think January will look a lot different than February. February is going to look a lot different than March and April as we go through, and as the vaccine rolls out. And as it's rolling out, I think more public confidence will be instilled in both our economy and our government, and we may see more individuals show up here and testify on bills. We're trying to do the best we can. We have a constitutional duty to have the chamber open to the public. We have a constitutional duty to be in the chamber voting. So there's only so much we can change as far as how we operate. But we certainly want to hear from our constituents and our voters. It's just going to look a lot different. And I think most Texans understand that, and they're appreciative of what we're trying to do.
I've read the various documents that have been circulated with the provisions for the session. And as I understand it, Mr. Chairman, coronavirus testing is not going to be required coming into the building. Is that right, for the public or for the staff or for members coming into the Capitol?
That is correct. So you have the option to test in a tent at the north side of the Capitol and then come into the building.
But it's an option. It's not a requirement.
It is an option, but each individual member, as always, can operate their office as they see fit. So if an individual member says, I only want someone who's tested negative today in my office, that is up to that individual member.
Right, but why wouldn't you require testing of people coming into the Capitol if you're going to convene the public, if you're going to open the building up to the public? Why would you not want to require testing of people who come into the building to be sure that somebody is not coming into the Capitol and spreading the virus to people who are there to exercise their rights as citizens to see government in play?
Sure. Well, we know that social distancing works. We know wearing a mask works. And we know that washing your hands and using hand sanitizer works. So we're going to do all those, and we're going to implement that throughout the Capitol. And that I think will go a long way. If we're not going to mandatory test at the schoolhouse, if we're not going to mandatory test at the courthouse, then we're not going to mandatory test at the Texas House.
Okay. So, but masks, Mr. Chairman, are required. If you come into the public areas of the Capitol, masks are required.
The preservation board has mandated all masks be worn in the common areas, just like you got to wear pants.
Right. And that applies not just to the public, but also to staff and members, right?
Correct. Now, on the House floor, yes, we would request all members to adhere by dress code, just like you have to wear a suit and tie and you have to wear a mask, correct?
Right. What are you prepared to do if a member flouts the mask rule? You and I both know that there are members of the legislature who have made their feelings about masks publicly known. What are you going to do if a member flouts the mask rule?
We have, so the chamber in of itself is everything past that front door as you walk in. So there are other rooms that are near or off the actual House floor that are considered inside the chamber for voting purposes. There's also the gallery, which is considered inside the chamber. So the House has to pass rules, and I think we plan on passing those rules on Thursday. And they may incorporate options for those who don't want to wear a mask, who feel like it's not necessary, to give them the opportunity to operate on the House floor or in the chamber that is not necessarily at their desk. Or it may be a room off the House floor, or maybe in the gallery. There's also an option for those who don't feel safe, who feel like that they're at risk given their health condition or their age, that even with masks and social distancing and everything else we may do, testing, that they still want to be off the House floor or in the gallery. So that will all be fleshed out on Thursday, and that's the members. It's the members' rules, and they will decide what they want to pass and what they don't pass. And then as speaker, I will enforce those rules.
But when the rules are passed, whatever they end up being, those rules are the rules, and they will be enforced, no exceptions.
Yeah, what the members decide, probably most likely this coming Thursday, whatever the members decide, whether it's COVID related or anything else that how they want to operate on the House floor or in committee, that will be enforced. Yes, sir.
Okay. So how do you address the pandemic from a policy rather than process standpoint? Obviously, this is the elephant in the room. It's the big story of the last year. The public health emergency is a huge thing for Texas and for all of us in our lives. What should the legislature's response to it be? Where are the specific policy areas that you believe you should be addressing that come out of this 10 or 11 months of this public health emergency?
Well, I think the most important thing is we don't lose grasp of this opportunity to improve our response to a healthcare crisis. This may not be the last pandemic we deal with over the next year, decade, our lifetime. Evan, I mean, this has been 102 years since we've been here, but that it can't happen 4 years from now. So we need to look at best practice and figure out exactly how we can handle the next healthcare crisis better, right? And I think we have a pretty good blueprint for it. I'll give the governor all the credit when he suspended various regulations across the board, whether it was in the restaurant industry, the oil and gas industry, the healthcare industry, you name it. Why not just keep those suspensions indefinitely? The world did not change. The sky did not fall. So that's one roadmap. Let's look at what helped our economy. Let's look at the deregulation that occurred and keep that, right?
Well, but that's, Mr. Chairman, that's the economy. I'm talking about health specifically. Policies around public health. What do you think we should be focusing on public health?
Well, I think if you look at, the pandemic is just, I think it kind of put a highlighter on what was already an issue, and that is areas around like rural Texas, where I am. I represent one of the largest counties the largest county in the state of Texas without a full-scale hospital. Yeah, and so it's the haves and the have-nots, and I think the pandemic has kind of shone a light on that, right? And even with the vaccine rollout, you look at areas that have not gotten the vaccine, it's because they just don't have the infrastructure, and it's a healthcare infrastructure. And so we've got a long way to go to improve that. There's no doubt about it. And this is a large state with a very diverse population, with a huge border, 1,200 miles of border. And so it's always been a difficult state to have, the most robust healthcare policy given who we are and how we operate in our economy. No, I tell you right now, I mean, if I could snap my fingers and put a hospital in Orange County, I would have done it yesterday. I mean, it is a problem. Rural healthcare is an issue, no doubt about it. But you look at things like telemedicine and telehealth and how it did help those areas of the state that did not have those options. That's that's a silver lining. We can build on telemedicine and telehealth to improve healthcare options for rural Texas.
Mr. Chairman, you know that Texas before the pandemic had more people without health insurance than any other state, and that since health insurance is tied in so many cases to employment, a lot of people lost their jobs in the last year. Our numbers have spiked up even higher than they were before. Should you all have a serious conversation about Medicaid expansion during this session, as some members want to do, or in your mind, is that discussion off the table?
Members from Republicans and Democrats have come to me to talk about improvement upon Medicaid. Yeah. Some want expansion. I don't think expansion's on the table. I don't think the votes are there for expansion. I think we can have a robust discussion about the improvements behind Medicaid, a Texas solution to Medicaid, right. One that is revenue neutral, one that does not tie us to billions of dollars in future expenditures. We will always have an issue with the uninsured because of the size of this state and the thousands of people who are moving here every single day and week. And they're not busting down the doors of Vermont, which has probably the best insured rate. They're coming to Texas. And so it's always going to be a challenging population. And, I've talked to members in the House across the spectrum who want to talk about healthcare. And now may be a good time to do it, given the pandemic and how we frame things up. But you've seen the budget. You see what it looks like. The number one expenditures is Article 3, which is public education, higher education. Right. The number 2 is healthcare. And that's 75% of the budget, right there.
Which is why some people, Mr. Chairman, believe that taking money that was our tax dollars that went to Washington, having them come back in the form of Medicaid expansion might provide some relief on the public health side and also on the budget side, right? Provide us with an infusion of money. You're saying it's off the table because you don't believe the votes are there. Are you going to shut down any discussion of that issue during this session? Or are you just predicting that the votes would not be there to actually pass it in the House?
I shut down no discussion on any bill. Again, I'm the arbitrator of the House. Yeah. And anyone can bring anything. They bring any amendment. We've had this amendment to expand Medicaid on the House floor for every session I've been in the legislature, and the votes have never been there. So let's talk about what can happen. Let's talk about a revenue neutral solution. Let's talk about a Texas solution. Let's talk about the federal government giving us our money back without a long-term multi-billion-dollar commitment. And then I think there are Republicans and Democrats alike who could band together and say, yeah, we just want our federal tax dollars back in the state of Texas, back in our healthcare system.
You were talking about the governor's decision to relax regulations during the pandemic and the impact that had on the economy. What should the legislature's focus be in terms of speeding a recovery economically? Because obviously we're in an unusual situation right now, Mr. Chairman. Our unemployment rate in Texas is higher than the national unemployment rate. There were many, many months for years where we were better than the rest of the country in terms of our unemployment rate and our economy. What are you prepared to do to fix this, to speed the recovery?
Well, I don't know if any governmental entity can fix the economy. I think the economy takes care of itself if government gets out of the way and allows the entrepreneurs and the business owners to get back to work. And I think one thing is if we do just not relax, but look at these regulations that were not necessary. That's a good first start, right? The last thing we should ever do is raise taxes and be punitive, especially to our small businesses who were shut down. It wasn't to their, they didn't want to be shut down. They wanted to be open. They wanted to operate respectfully with social distancing, and there are now, and they're doing well. The ones that are open, the PPP and the CARES Act, it had its limits. Eventually, we got to get back to business, and we are back to business. And I think the economy here in Texas is coming back stronger than many realize, and I think you saw that today. We were supposed to have a $4.6 billion deficit for this biennium, and it's less than $1 billion now. Right. And that's just over the last several months. So the economy in Texas is coming back. It's going to take a little bit longer. Of course, we like to say that we're more diversified than we ever have been, but we still are tied quite a bit to the oil and gas industry. And as that recovers, and it is slowly coming back, then you'll see, I think, the economic recovery that we all want. And I think we will grow our way out of this economic funk that we're in right now.
I think I heard you answer this, but I want to be clear. The government has now said, the governor, has now said no more shutdowns of business. You agree with that? You agree, no more shutdowns. Despite the coronavirus raging, no more shutdowns of business.
No more shutdowns of business. And I think it was Mayor Cuomo who tweeted about 45 minutes ago that he said no more government shutdowns.
Right.
And regardless of when the vaccine is rolled out to respectable level that we can all it is time to reopen the economy. And that's coming from Andrew Cuomo in New York. So I think all the governors realize it is time to get back to business.
Right. Do you think it was a mistake, Chairman Phelan, for the governor to issue orders without consulting the legislature or bringing you all back into session during the pandemic? You know this has been a topic of conversation. When I ask you, should there be legislation this session to prevent that from happening in the future?
Well, you're talking to a House member who had four state declared disasters in 11 months in my district.
Yeah.
2 natural disasters, a plane explosion, and COVID-19. So I've seen the Chapter 418 powers do extraordinary things of getting my people, my voters, my constituents back into school, back to work, get the roads cleaned up, the power lines strung back up, and everyone back to life as normal as possible. The governor did all he could do given the circumstances of a pandemic, a 102-year pandemic thrown in his lap. When you have to make decisions, split-second decisions on how to operate under a pandemic, it's very, very difficult. It's a lose-lose situation. I thought he did as best as he could. We can talk about how you want to handle pandemics going forward. I think that's something that many members in the House want to talk about. But you also understand how Chapter 418s do benefit a community when they're in dire straits, and it really does benefit. I've seen it firsthand. And the governor wrote the book on how to respond to hurricanes. It's actually a book called The Eye of the Storm, the 158-page book that John Sharp wrote with him about how to respond to hurricanes. So I've seen the extraordinary benefits of Chapter 418s, and I hope other members can appreciate that.
Let me stay with the tension between the state and local officials for a second. Speaker Bonin said in the Michael Quinn Sullivan tape, now infamously, "My goal is for this to be the worst session in the history of the legislature for cities and counties." Is that your goal this session, Chairman?
My goal is to empower the members to be as best as they can be and bring whatever legislation to the House floor that is important to their districts. I want them to vote their districts. I want them to do what they're sent to Austin to do, which is be a member of a constitutional representative democracy. And I am not focused on cities and counties. I'm not focused on anything else other than the operation.
Are you on the side of cities and counties, Chairman Phelan?
I take no sides on either of them. I have a great relationship with my mayors. I have a great relationship with my county judges. You can call and ask them. I talk to them on a daily basis. There is no animosity there.
Will a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying by local governments, as some have proposed, have your support this session?
Well, again, like any other piece of legislation outside of the budget, redistricting, and economic recovery, it's up to those House members to bring that to the House floor, to get the votes through the committee process, through calendars, and onto the House floor. As you know, last session, I was a joint author of it. I was on the back mic defending that bill. I think it has merits. As a House member, I thought it had tremendous merits as far as allowing the citizens understand where their money is going and where it should or should not be lobbied. But it's going to be up to a House member to file that bill and get his or her colleagues to support it through the process, just like any other bill that's going to come through the process next session.
How certain are you? You said earlier that nothing was off the table in terms of cuts. Let me actually invert that question and ask you how certain you are that you will be able to find the money to fund the school finance reforms passed in 2019, the teacher pay increase, the funding of pre-K, the increase in the per student allotment. Should the people who benefited from that work last time be worried that that will not be extended another 2 years? Can you make a commitment about that?
I will make a commitment that we'll do everything we can to make certain we fulfill our responsibilities. But again, it is a huge state. It is a large budget. We just got the numbers 2 hours and 29 minutes ago.
Right.
So it's going to have to go through the process, and we're going to have hearings, open hearings to the public, and go through whatever. It was a monumental bill last session. We solved a lot of problems with the formulas and the property tax reform. But again, it's not an easy task to dig yourself out of the hole that we will find ourselves in next session. But we want to have a full commitment to our students and to our teachers. I've got 4 boys, and I had to distance learn my children, my wife and I went from being a teacher to the janitor and the lunch lady in about a week's time.
Yeah.
Because I saw how difficult it is, and I've always had tremendous respect for teachers, but now I have a newfound respect for teachers. And I think every member of the legislature who has children who went through what I went through feels the same way.
Mr. Chairman, we just have a little time left, so I want to pivot to politics if I can. There's a rift between Democrats and Republicans always, but there's not always a rift between Republicans and Republicans. And there appears to be a rift between some in your party. You have the Republican Party Chairman Alan West, for instance, rallying outside the governor's mansion and attacking you personally as a, quote, political traitor for courting support from Democrats. What is your response to the chairman of your party when he calls you a traitor?
Well, I'm not going to respond to him per se. I'll just respond.
Why not, Mr. Chairman? Why not? He called you a traitor.
Well, if you want to know a lot about yourself, go run for Speaker of the Texas House, and you have a lot of people call you a lot of things, and you don't really respond to every single one of them because you got a task at hand, and the task at hand is leading the Texas House forward, leading the state of Texas forward in a budget deficit, redistricting, and a global pandemic, right? So you focus on what you actually can, you can impact. And so what I like to tell individuals is that I've been around the Texas House for a long time.
Yep.
I started here in 1994 as a young staffer. I worked in the Texas Senate. I worked in the U.S. Congress, and I went back home and got into real estate and started having babies and never thought I'd come back here. But I do know a lot about this building and about this institution. And we've always had a model, and the model that's worked pretty darn well. And it's not always about Republican versus Democrat. And it's not always about, left versus right. This is a process that works. And it's worked pretty darn well. And when Democrats were in power, Republicans were given chairs respective of their membership in the body. And the same has happened over the last 3 Republican speakers, and it will happen with myself as a Republican speaker.
So it will happen. You're confirming that. You know that there are 4 members of the Republican caucus, Jeff Kaysen and Brian Slayton, who are new members. Tony Tinderholt and Kyle Biederman have been around for a while, who've asked you point blank to not have Democratic chairs. No. You are saying you will have Democratic chairs for sure this session.
We will have Democratic chairs this session. We've had a process here for 172 years. It's worked pretty well. 1,000 people move here every day for a reason, and I don't see any reason to change it.
Yeah. Okay. Last question, Mr. Chairman. What about the Biden administration? The last time we had a Democratic president, all 8 years of his 2 terms, Texas behaved effectively like the People's Republic of anti-Obama. Everything he was for, we were against. Everything we were for, he was against. I'm old enough to remember when Greg Abbott used to brag about suing the federal government every day. Are we in for a return to those days, or do you think you and the legislature can find common ground to work with the federal government?
I can't speak for anyone other than myself, and I've got an open door policy. I will work with anyone on any issue if it's good for Texas, and especially if it's good for Southeast Texas,
right.
and House District 21. I got to where I am right now about being willing to work with anybody. The great thing, Evan, about being from a rural area, small little area in Southeast Texas like I am, and you've got to work with everybody. And I learned from day one that my votes that I have to have for any particular bill, they can come from anywhere. I just got to go get my votes. And that's what I think members need to understand is we all have to work with one another. I hope we don't have an adversarial relationship with Washington, D.C. D.C. is broken. We've seen that. It is not work like the legislature does. I mean, Evan, I think you covered this body and you covered this building for a reason, because it's things actually occur here. Things actually happen for the betterment of all Texans. And I just want to see that continue to happen. Whether others want to work with D.C. or not, I don't know. But I think here in the Texas House, we're all willing to do whatever works for the people of Texas.
All right. I can't believe we're out of time. But with that, Mr. Chairman, we are, in fact, out of time. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to our sponsors. Thanks especially to all of you for tuning in. To keep up with the Tribune's coverage of the session, visit texastribune.org or sign up to get the latest news from the legislature in your inbox at trib.it/ledge. Stay safe, everybody. See you soon. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.